In the scholarly commonwealths at the university, there must be a faculty which, in its teachings independent of the government, has no commands to give, but still has the freedom to judge them all, which is concerned with the scientific interest, that is the one for truth, where reason must have the right to speak publicly, because without such, truth, to the detriment of the government itself, would not come to light, but reason is, according to its nature, free and accepts no commands to hold something to be true, no crede, but only a free credo. That such a faculty, despite this great merit of freedom, is still called the lower one, however, for that the reason can be found in the nature of man, that he who can command, despite being the humble servant of another, still considers himself more distinguished than somebody else who may be free but has no one to command. Immanuel Kant. I've spent 5 lectures now talking about what philosophy means to Kant. And I want to close off this topic with one more lecture in which I want to look at what is the philosopher to Kant, since we now know what philosophy is, and what is his role, specifically in contrast to the role of other scholars. Of course, the question, what is a philosopher, has basically already been answered by the previous lectures. The philosopher, in the school sense of the word, is the rational scientist through concepts. And more specifically, he is the metaphysician who, above all else, deals with our 3 ideas of God, freedom, and immortality of the soul. While, on the other hand, the philosopher in the world sense of the word is the sage, the wise man, who is focused and oriented on the idea of the purpose, the vocation of humanity, and who, with that, functions as the lawgiver of reason towards the various sciences, but also in life, like as I explained in the last lecture, like for example when health is concerned, and where through the right way of living, a sort of stoic way of reining one's own mind and thereby one's bodily afflictions, is serving as a dietetic art to keep us healthy and to, so to say, keep the doctor away. Now, if we look at the history of philosophy, it becomes very obvious that some philosophers may lean more into the school sense of the word, like Kant himself, while others, like for example Socrates, may lean more into the world sense of the word. And some, like on the one hand Heidegger, or on the other hand my dad, may be almost exclusively one or the other. Nonetheless, Kant would say that the true philosopher should be both. In Kant's mind, both of those form a unity, and both parts are incomplete without the other part. The mere metaphysician who only does speculative thinking about various metaphysical questions, for example, thinking about is the world made up of small, not further divisible parts, or can it be divided forever and ever, or even who thinks about the 3 main ideas of God, freedom, and immortality, if he is only doing speculative metaphysics, and not caring much about what the answers he may give in a speculation mean for us, not caring much about how to lead one's life, not caring much about our vocation as humans, um, then to Kant, he is a mere philodox, a mere technician of reason, and I might add, Kant's critical philosophy points out that he's not even a good one. The natural scientist makes a much better technician of reason. And this metaphysician could even think so far as to become a mere sophist, who uses his art, who uses his argumentation to serve any given purpose and to prove any given statement. And that certainly is not true philosophy. On the other hand, the person who is a philosopher in a world sense, without having the science of philosophy, without doing philosophy in the school sense, certainly has more right to call himself a philosopher. That is this school sense, what philosophy is ultimately about, wisdom. But nonetheless, Kant would say that this sage needs the science, needs metaphysics. It should serve, Kant says, as a propedeutics, that is an introduction, or it should serve as an organon, that is as a tool to wisdom. The wisdom should not be based just on some vague sense of what is right, some vague intuition that the wise man may believe to have, some higher insight, but it should be based in actual science. The question that the philosopher as lawgiver of reason has to answer, the question, what is the human being, made up of the questions, what can I know, what should I do, what may I hope for, has to be answered through science. And science, as an introduction to wisdom and tool for wisdom, has to build the basis and the fundament of true wisdom, so that the person trying to be wise doesn't stray and become a fool by accident. So therefore, to Kant, the scientific side, the school side of philosophy is very much needed, but in service to the world side, to the wisdom. I talked in my lecture on metaphysics, I talked about this term of Weltweisheit, that is world wisdom, which in Kant's days was used as a German translation of philosophy. Kant does use it. He goes with the usage of the word as it was common back then, but still he does say that it would be more fitting to call the science not Weltweisheit, but Weltwissenschaft, that is world science, while keeping the name of Weltweisheit, world wisdom, for the practical side of philosophy, that is for morals. And only both of them together, the theoretical science and the practical morality, that is knowing the vocation and the purpose and the limits of the human being, both of the human intellect and of the human will, both theoretically and practically, both together makes up philosophy to Kant. And I would argue that his whole critical project, his critical philosophy that he lays out in the three critiques, and that I will talk about in upcoming lectures, um, in the end is meant to point out to the school philosophers, to the metaphysicians, that they should not be mere philodoxes, but rather that their science, that their speculation should be done in service to wisdom, should be done once again as a preparation and a tool to be a philosopher in the world sense. When talking about what is a philosopher or who is a philosopher, I also want to address who isn't a philosopher. And that, I think, is a very important question nowadays, because nowadays the word philosopher, the title of philosopher, is given without much thought to pretty much anyone. The mere philosophologist, that is how I call the historian of philosophy, how I call the person dealing with philosophy, with philosophical systems, with the statements and writings of the philosophers. The mere philosophologist is nowadays referred to as a philosopher. Every professor teaching at a university is called a philosopher. That is, of course, complete nonsense. That is completely absurd, of course. It is like if you would call every professor of literature a poet. And Kant does remark at some point that a work, a text on poetry, is not a poetic text unless maybe it is written in verses. And likewise, a text on philosophy is not necessarily the same as a philosophical text. And I also want to talk about this topic, so who isn't a philosopher, because some people might dislike how I dismiss pretty much everyone who nowadays is called a philosopher, and how I insist that they are not. Some people might take that to be arrogance. But to that, I can say that Kant did the same. He didn't have a very high opinion of most of his colleagues. He didn't have a very high opinion of the regular professor of philosophy in 18th century Germany. He very often talks about the so-called philosophers, about the philosophers merely in name, or about the metaphysical blabberers. Most of them he didn't consider philosophers. And that is not something unique to Kant, or to myself for that matter. That is something that, as a pattern, goes through the whole history of philosophy, starting with Socrates and Plato, who were antagonistic to the sophists of their time. So, to those who called themselves not merely philosophers, lovers of wisdom, but sophists, the wise, the sages. So starting with Socrates and Plato, and then throughout the whole history of philosophy, whether you have someone like Kant or Fichte or Nietzsche, or I already mentioned in a previous lecture, the one on what is philosophy. I already mentioned Hannah Arendt and what she thought of the German intellectuals who so easily and so readily fell in line when the Nazis rose to power. It is so common for pretty much any serious thinker, pretty much any deep thinker, to have a pretty low opinion of the common intellectuals of their day, that I would say this already is a criterion by which you can tell who isn't a philosopher. That is, if someone takes seriously most of the so-called philosophers of his time, and if someone grants them the title of philosopher, then you can be assured that he himself is not a philosopher, that he himself is a very shallow thinker, and that he himself is not a lawgiver. That is, he is someone not willing, not courageous enough to pass judgment and to say, this is a philosopher and this is not. And I know that we live in a time of timidness and a time of universal equality, of rather of universal sameness, a time that fears the idea of rank and the idea of differences and of differentiating between people. I mean, what would be the correct word for differentiating? If we look at Latin, it would be discriminating between people. Discriminating simply means making a difference, telling a difference. And the mere fact that this has now become a bad word, that this has now become something to be avoided, all we can think about when we hear about discrimination is bad sorts of discrimination, is discriminating people to then give some of them a better treatment than others, and to give some of them more rights and some of them less rights than others. The mere fact that this is all we can think about when we hear discrimination, which in itself is a neutral word, which can mean something bad, but it could also mean something good, tells a lot about our time. But I'm a philosopher, and as a philosopher, I have to be untimely. So I do want to stress that no, not everyone is a philosopher. Not to Kant either, not just to me. In the world sense, Kant says, no one really is a philosopher. The philosopher in the world sense, the sage, is more of an ideal we can strive for. And Kant says that some of the ancients, and in his own days, Rousseau, are the people who came closest to this ideal. But true wisdom is only in God. And therefore, there is no true philosopher if we are strict. And to call oneself a philosopher in the world sense, to call oneself wise, would almost be presumptuous and arrogant. But even in the school sense, Kant does not grant the title of philosopher lightly to just anyone. Because Kant says that only historical scholarship and mathematics are sciences that really can be learned. Which is also why he says that only the historical scholar and the mathematician are scholars in the stricter sense. That is, people who were schooled to learn something, while the philosopher, that is the school philosopher, strictly speaking, is not a scholar. And here Kant is not referring to just metaphysics, but to all of philosophy. I remind you, I talked about this in previous lectures, mainly in the one on metaphysics. I remind you that natural science also belongs to philosophy in the school sense, to Kant. And here he stresses that you can't learn philosophy, you can only learn to philosophize. That is because the source of philosophy, Kant says, needs to be your own intellect, your own reason, not just someone else's. You can, of course, historically learn certain statements by philosophers that came before you, but just learning those and memorizing those doesn't make you a philosopher, because it doesn't mean that you yourself can do philosophy. In historical scholarship, well, having historic knowledge is all there is to it. So by acquiring that knowledge, or that awareness, as I called it, you have it, and that's all. And in mathematics, since it is based on intuition, since it is based on constructing concepts in intuition, if you learn how to do that, you yourself can do mathematics. If you learn a certain mathematical formula, you yourself can apply it to various tasks. But in philosophy, it is not enough to have historical knowledge, Kant would say. And once again, this also applies for natural science. All of this is in one way, he says, related to art, because just like art, philosophy requires genius in a way. And genius Kant translates as original spirit. So being able to have your own, to have new ideas. You can, of course, learn some philosophy, some theory historically, but Kant compares that to someone who learns how to play a certain song. So even without being able to play the piano, I could memorize how to play, let's say, Jingle Bells. I could memorize which keys I have to press in which succession. But if I ever forgot that, I couldn't reproduce it. And I also couldn't play any other songs. While someone who really knows how to play the piano doesn't need to learn and to memorize every single piece of music. He should be able to, when he hears that music, to reproduce what he heard. And he should also be able to play his own music, to play new pieces of music. And in the same way, someone could, of course, let's say in physics, have had historical knowledge of Newtonian physics and could have been able to reproduce that, so to speak. But with that, he would never have come up with the physics of Einstein and with Einstein's theory of relativity. It needed a genius like Einstein to make this new step in physics. And therefore, once again, Kant stresses that you can't learn philosophy. You can only learn how to philosophize, that is, how to think, how to do philosophy. That is a method of philosophy, which also is the topic I will address in the next lecture. But for now, I still want to stay at the topic of who is and who isn't a philosopher and what is his role. Kant was very much an enemy of what he called the spirit of imitating or the spirit of emulating. That is simply copying someone else's philosophy and In his day and age in Germany, that was mostly Christian Wolff, and most of the professors at universities were probably Wolffians, and just teaching and copying the Wolffian theories and the Wolffian system. And while Kant had respect for Wolff himself, he didn't have much respect for the Wolffians. I would say that Kant was against all forms of Jens, uh, be they Wolffian or also Kantian later on. He didn't care too much for his own followers who were merely followers either. For that reason, I would say, even if it may sound paradoxical, if you are a Kantian, you are not a true Kantian. To be a true Kantian, you need to not be a Kantian. And we can see that in the history of philosophy. We can see that in Kant's own days. So when his critiques came out in the later 1780s and then 1790s, many of the younger generation of thinkers, of intellectuals in Germany were very enthusiastic about that and became Kantians. But most of them, with a few exceptions like Fichte, who carried on Kant's thought and who went deeper than Kant had, who continued on Kant's path, but with a few exceptions, most of them didn't matter much. Most of them were very superficial and were just merely copying and repeating what Kant had said. And the same, I would say, is even more true for the so-called Neu-Kantianer, that is Neo-Kantians, who became prominent in Germany in the latter half of the 19th century. And the same is true for those professors, those scholars of philosophy nowadays who are Kantians of some sort, who subscribe to Kant's philosophy. All of these people may have read Kant. They may even be great scholars. That is, they may know a lot about Kant. They may be able to repeat a lot of his statements, to talk a lot about his system and to explain his system. But since they just treat it as a doctrine of theoretical statements, for example, as a theory of knowledge and of cognition, that may be true, that they may subscribe to as a true doctrine as compared to other doctrines, but since they don't treat it as more, that is, since they don't look at what Kant actually wanted, what his actual aim was, since they don't use the truths that Kant found, the truths that they may subscribe to apply it to life, to be wise, to now act as lawgivers to life and to science and to humanity. Since they don't take up the moral imperative at the center of Kant's philosophy, they ultimately are not true Kantians, but rather betray Kant's actual philosophy or don't understand it at all. Likewise, if you just blindly follow Kant and blindly agree with everything he says, that is not in the spirit of Kant. And that is also not what I want to do. As these lectures will go on, even though I agree with Kant on a lot of things, and even though I hold Kant to be very important, I will also, especially at the end of all these lectures, but also from time to time in between, I will also criticize Kant where he needs to be criticized. And that is presumably what Kant himself would have wanted, as he himself says that no philosophy, no system of philosophy is perfect and without needing any modifications or any fixes. He would say that, ironically, the more philosophy you learn, the more you move away from philosophy, because the more you become just a copy, just a shadow of someone else, instead of being your own free thinker. These views of Kant's, of course, have implications or consequences for teaching and studying philosophy. Kant would say that you can't learn philosophy from a book, because no book, including his books, including the Critique of Pure Reason, no book actually contains real philosophy. Books, he would say, contain merely a retelling, a history of the undertakings and of the efforts of the human intellect in finding truth. And I want to stress that this, of course, goes for these lectures of mine on Kant. They are just a retelling, they are just a history of what Kant said, of Kant's efforts to find truth. But they are not themselves philosophy, or rather, they themselves won't teach you philosophy. We must not, Kant says, just learn someone else's judgments. We must judge ourselves. And there is, he says, no classical author in philosophy. When it comes to language, he says it would be absurd to criticize Cicero and say that he didn't speak good Latin, because what is and what isn't good Latin is determined by Cicero. That can only be learned through Cicero. But you can, on the other hand, very well read Leibniz and criticize him and say that something he wrote here is not good philosophy. And likewise, you could read Kant and criticize him. Because what is and isn't good philosophy is not determined by Leibniz or by Kant or by Plato or whoever. It is determined by reason, and we have to use our own reason. And therefore, when reading a philosopher or hearing about a philosopher, Kant says, it should be food for our own thoughts, and it should be an occasion to judge with the philosopher and even against the philosopher we are reading. And this is how Kant would teach, because teaching at universities back then worked a little differently from today, and it was common practice for the teacher, for the professor, to use some book and to basically, over the course of his class, work through that book, to teach his students from that book and to explain that book to them. And how closely someone stuck to the book he used very much depended on the professor. So surely there were professors who basically just repeated what their book that they used for their class said, and who didn't think for themselves or didn't make any judgments about that book at all. Well, Kant, on the other hand, he also used books, and that is, in the 18th century, he would use books that came from the Wolffian school of philosophy. He would use Wolffian books just like his colleagues in his teaching, even in his later classes when he had developed his own critical system. But he would, and you can still see that when reading his lectures, especially his later lectures, became more and more independent of these books. He would use them simply to give certain topics, like saying, well, now the author is talking about the soul, now the author is talking about God. Um, and so he would talk about the soul or about God now, but he would not just repeat what the author said. He would talk about these topics very freely, or he would say in his lectures, well, the author is now giving this argument for the immortality of the soul. This argument, however, is wrong for this and that reason. And there are also two other possible arguments that the author didn't go into, but that he could also have given, but they, however, are also wrong. So his way of teaching with these books was very much independent and free. And once again, what he stressed to his students, what he wanted them to do is not merely swallow up and memorize something that some author had said, but to learn while reading, to think and judge for themselves. Because, for one, Kant would say no system of philosophy is complete and is correct in every single statement, um, and not needing any corrections. But even if it was, if you just memorized it, you could face several problems. For example, you could forget what you memorize. Now, if you learn to think for yourself, you could recreate the system for yourself. You could know the system starts from A, and then you could know that, well, from A there must follow B. But if you can't think for yourself, if you just remember that B follows after A and now you forgot that B follows, now you will be lost. You will not know, did B come after A or did C come after A? And likewise, what if there is an opponent of that philosophy, of that system, attacking it with new counter arguments? And the original thinker, the original author of that system, didn't know these new counter arguments yet, and therefore didn't provide answers for these counter arguments. Maybe these new arguments are false. Maybe the system could stand against them. But since you only learned the system insofar as it was written down by its author, and since he didn't have any replies for these new arguments, you can now not defend the system. While if you have learned to think for yourself, you could apply the old system to new situations, and you could probably come up with new answers to these counter arguments. So therefore, one has to learn to think for oneself. One has to learn to philosophize and not just to historically learn some philosophy. But now that I have addressed who is a philosopher and who isn't a philosopher, I want to look at the role of the philosopher. I mentioned before in my lecture on metaphysics that universities in Kant's time were structured into the three higher faculties of theology, law, and medicine, and the lower faculty of philosophy. And the thing is, Kant would say that the higher faculties do make use of philosophy, insofar as they too are trying to work as rational sciences that try to have cognition through concepts. So they do use the philosophical method, at least. And that is a good thing. That is progress, Kant would say. He says that the ancient Greeks had religion without theology. They had laws without jurisprudence, and they had healing arts without medicine. And the only fields that were somewhat treated scientifically back then, he would say, were mathematics and philosophy, whether it's metaphysics or whether it's natural science. Um, but they were, for one, these two were not yet connected, and that, Kant says, came at the detriment of natural science. He would say that it was a big improvement and a big progress that in modern times the applied philosophy, the natural science, had connected itself with mathematics, that mathematics has been started to be used in physics. And on the other hand, these two, mathematics and philosophy, Kant would say, for the ancients were just the practice or the endeavor of certain individuals who were interested in it, but they were not really a concern of the state. The progress to him comes through Christianity, because Christianity adopted philosophy, adopted the methods, the rational thinking and arguing of the philosophers, to apply it to religion. And that's how we got theology as a science or as a scholarly field. And throughout the Middle Ages, the universities with their various faculties would be founded, and the practices of law and of healing would copy what religion had done, and also apply philosophy and the philosophical method to turn into the sciences of jurisprudence and medicine. And all of that, Kant says, very much benefited the state, which now had an interest in these sciences, and which now organized them and sponsored them at the universities. However, these faculties tend to get into conflict with philosophy, especially since they do make use of philosophy, of the philosophical method. And I already talked about in my opening lecture on Kant's life about how this topic of the conflict of the faculties was something he concerned himself with, especially in the first half of the 1790s, especially after he had finished up working on his critical project. And I mentioned it, how he did write a small book titled The Conflict of the Faculties, made up of 3 essays dealing with the conflicts between the faculty of philosophy and the 3 other faculties. But I would say that the topic is not just dealt with in this book, which bears this title, but that other texts of Kant also deal with the conflicts between philosophy and this or that faculty. And here in this lecture, I don't want to talk about the specific matter of each of these 3 conflicts so much. I will do that in other lectures. As far as the conflict between philosophy and medicine is concerned, I have already done so in the last lecture. And as for the conflict with theology, I will talk about that further when I talk about Kant's philosophy of religion. And as for the conflict with the faculty of jurisprudence, I will talk about that further when I talk about Kant's philosophy of justice, and when I talk about Kant's anthropology, about Kant's view of the human. What I want to do here is take this topic of the conflict between philosophy and the 3 higher faculties as a whole, and I want to examine what this conflict is about. What unites these 3 conflicts, Because even if we abstract from the three different matters, from the three different questions Kant deals with, the form of the conflict, so what the higher faculty stands for and what philosophy stands for and why they get in conflict with each other, is always the same in all three of these matters. And this, I hope to show, is a very, very important topic. It's not just some side topic of Kant's philosophy, but rather it is at the core of Kant's whole thinking, and it helps us understand Kant's whole thinking. And therefore, I want to examine this conflict of faculties from four different perspectives, because it could be described by the relationship that the three higher faculties and the philosophical faculty, respectively, have to reason, the relationship that they have to the common, to the lay person, to the non-scholarly person, the relationship that they have to power, and finally the relationship that they have to morality. So first off, what relationship do the faculties have to reason? Well, the three higher faculties are empiricist in nature, that is focused on experience. So they look at what is there, what is given to them, and they go from there, which in tendency means that the human being, the thinking being here, is dependent in his thinking, is passive in his thinking, is a victim. The philosophy, and that is Aufklärt, is rationalist. That is, it is using reason, it is thinking for itself. So let's examine the three conflicts philosophy has with the faculties. Well, theology would base its statements on a certain revelation, be it the Bible, be it the Quran, and probably also a certain tradition that formed based on that revelation. But that, of course, is empirical. That is something that is given. We don't understand that it has to be that way. So if someone tells me God wants you to pray 5 times a day, maybe that's true, but I don't see how it has to be true. I can only know that it is true because I have been told, because it was revealed to me. As far as I understand, God could also want me to pray 4 times a day, or 6 times a day, or not at all, or all the time, or whatever. And so the theologian would say that in order to please God and therefore to secure a place in heaven, we need to do certain things. We need to accept Jesus, or we need to, as I said, pray 5 times a day. We need to not have sex before marriage, or to not be gay, or whatever. While the philosopher, on the other hand, would stick not to what is given to him, not to what has been revealed and passed down, but only to what his own reason tells him. So he would think about this, he would reflect about this, and he would say, well, if God is good, then he won't punish someone who has always been good and virtuous simply for having been in the wrong club. So for having gone to church and not to the mosque, or the other way around. And he won't punish someone for not having followed some arbitrary rule and not done some ritual that didn't benefit anyone. He won't throw a good person into hell just because that person didn't pray enough, or just because that person didn't fast during Ramadan or whatever. But rather, reason tells me that a good God will reward goodness. Likewise, the jurist, and here you must not just think of the advocate or of the judge, but of all the officials of state and of all the politicians. The jurist would say, well, the human being as he is given to us is rotten, is evil. The humans are selfish, they are lying and deceiving, they are aggressive, and so on and so on. And therefore, our laws and our policies and our politic have to take that into account, and they have to be cynical power politics. We have to subjugate these evil humans with their evil drives and try to bring some order into the chaos, and we have to deceive and to destroy our political enemies, like neighboring countries that we might be at war with, to secure our own safety. The philosopher, on the other hand, says, well, whatever experience might tell us, and sure, experience of human beings and how they behave might show that very often human beings are not exactly behaving in a good way. But whatever is given to us, whatever may be human nature according to experience, doesn't concern me. As a philosopher, I am just asking reason, and reason tells me that humans should live in freedom and peace. That outwardly there should be peace between the various states, and inwardly there should be freedom in the state. The state should be a republic and not a despotic tyranny. And therefore, I don't care whatever human nature may be, and I don't care about you telling me that this is not possible. There will always be war, and humans can't deal with freedom. They will just mess it up. Reason tells me they should have peace and freedom. And likewise, the physician, and here you might think of the last lecture and what I said about Hoffman and his school of mechanists. The physician will say, what is given to us is the material human body, and that appears to be a biological machine. So we will treat him like that, as a machine that might fail sometimes, that might weak sometimes, and that then needs to be repaired and fixed. And therefore, we will treat him as a victim, as something passive. But once again, the philosopher will not ask experience, the philosopher will ask reason, and reason will tell him that the human being is also a spiritual being, not just a physical being. That the human being has an intellect, has reason, has free will, and can, through his reason, influence himself, discipline and reign himself, and thereby influence himself, his own body, and how he deals with his body, with his afflictions, with things like pain or like spasms, like illnesses, and so on. So one could say that the philosopher, as Kant views him, is sort of the advocate of common sense. The philosopher, in that sense, is not a special scholar with special deeper knowledge, but rather what he is thinking is simply what every human being is thinking or should be thinking, if he is aufklärt. So if he is making use of his own rationality. while on the other hand, the members of these three other faculties, they have learned something. They are scholars, and they therefore disagree with what common sense and what an aufklärt reason tells us, and say, well, yeah, your thinking might say that just being good is good enough for God, or that humans should live in peace and freedom, or that you can deal with your own afflictions, with your own pains, and so on. But I, as a learned man, I, as a scholar, I know better. I have certain knowledge that you don't have, and that your simple common sense can't just grasp. And with my knowledge, I tell you that this is wrong. In my lecture on science, I talked about the difference between rational and empirical or historical knowledge. And well, rational knowledge is necessary. So if I think about it and if I understand it through my reflection, then I understand it must be that way. So I can understand that the shortest possible connection between 2 points must be a straight line. But anything that is empirical is not necessary. So we know through experience that ravens are black, but it is not necessary. There could be a world where ravens are white, and if we made the experience that all the ravens are not black but white, then that would be our knowledge. So therefore, anything empirical must be learned. And this is where scholarship is needed. And Kant would, of course, say that scholarship is needed and will always be needed in many areas. So, for example, there are countless species of insects that the normal person may not know. And some specialists, some biologists who specializes in the study of insects may know many species of insect that I don't know. But then I don't have to know all the insects in the world. It's good that someone studies it, but it is not necessary for our lives, and not everyone has to study it. So here, it is not a problem that scholars exist, that experts exist. But Kant would say that it is a problem that they exist in the areas that concern all of us. And that is the future of our soul, whether I go to heaven or to hell. That is the way I live in community with my fellow human beings, the way I live in the state, and the way the states live with each other, and that is my own health. These are things that are the concerns of everyone, and therefore reason itself dictates that they must not be put simply in the hands of experts, because that would mean that every human being only has the choice to either become an expert himself, to either study these things, but that can't be expected of everyone. And even if you study one of these three fields, you can't possibly study all of them. So even the experts will still depend on other experts in other areas. Or if you have not studied one of these, if you are not a theologian or jurist or physician, then you must depend on others. Then you must necessarily be unaufklärt. That is, you must give up your own thinking, your own rationality in the very fields that matter most to you, and blindly follow what someone else, what your priest, or what some politician, or what some physician tells you. And that, Kant says, must not be. And therefore he considers it the task of science, of scholarship, to in a way make itself disappear eventually. Not all of science, not all of scholarship, but the parts that concern everyone, that is especially these three higher faculties. Their task, their vocation, if they are aufklärt, if they themselves want to be rational and not abuse their power and their expertise, should be to work towards becoming more and more irrelevant. Probably never completely irrelevant. They will probably always be needed somewhat. Most of them probably the physician, least of them probably the theologian. But they should strive to become more and more irrelevant by making religion, making the laws, making health as simple as possible, so that they can mostly be dealt with through common sense and mostly don't require experts that we have to listen to. And the only faculty out of the four that should continue and that will always remain necessary, therefore, is the philosophical faculty, but not so that the philosophers can now be the experts and so that people now blindly follow the philosophers, but only so that the philosophers are the guardians of the people and of their concerns, of their common sense, so to speak, against the three higher faculties, making sure the higher faculties don't presume to rule over the people, but continue working towards becoming more and more irrelevant. With Kant, we could say that the pious person doesn't need a priest. The just person who doesn't break any laws doesn't need an advocate, at least if the just person also lives in a just state and not in some tyranny. And the healthy person doesn't need a physician. And therefore we can again look at the three fields, and then we can say that in religion, Kant was very much against what he would call superstition, that is believing that God requires anything else from you but being moral and virtuous. That is believing that God requires you to believe in certain historical truths. Yeah? Believe that this and that guy was a prophet, believe in this and that miracle, and believing that God requires you to follow certain artificial and arbitrary rules and rituals that have nothing to do with morality. Because if belief in historical statements and if certain rituals and commandments are a requirement, then religion does need experts, does need scholars. Then we do need the priests and rabbis and imams to tell us what to do. First off, because the holy books are written in different, in foreign and dead languages, and to even understand them correctly, because a mere translation would always be an interpretation, and we would always then depend on the translator. To understand them correctly, one would have to learn these languages, but it can't be required for every single person to learn Hebrew or Greek or Arabic. So therefore we would rely on the scholars who did learn it. And then with that comes a lot of further knowledge. Knowledge of tradition, of how these texts are or have been used to be interpreted in a certain tradition. And there would probably be a lot more texts produced by that tradition to help with the interpretation. Texts like the Talmud, where the rabbis discuss how exactly to understand and to apply the laws of the Torah, or texts like the Hadith, that supposedly tell you about the deeds and sayings of Muhammad, and thereby are supposed to help in better understanding what the Quran actually says and actually wants from you. That requires expertise, that requires scholarship. And Kant was against that. He was for a more simple religion where everyone can simply think rationally about what an all good, all holy God might want from him. As a side note, nowadays I find that Kant sometimes is accused of anti-Semitism. That accusation unfortunately has become kind of an empty accusation, because it is often thrown around very mindlessly. So pretty much any of our long dead thinkers by now has been accused of having been an anti-Semite, and that is doing a disservice, I would say, to the cause of fighting racism and fighting anti-Semitism, because thereby the word and the accusation loses its meaning and loses its weight and becomes something harmless or something that people don't take seriously anymore. Well, in Kant's case, I will talk about his racism and also about his views on the Jews in a much later lecture. But I will remark that here already this should help you understand Kant's views of the Jews better. He wasn't racist against the Jews as people on a racial basis, not at all. I mean, he did consider them part of the white race anyways. And he did hope that eventually the Jews could be granted equal citizenship, which they didn't have in his time. And even when it came to faith, he would not have them required to simply convert to Christianity. Many of his contemporaries would have made that a requirement before granting the Jews full citizenship, while Kant said that the Jews would not have to accept that Jesus was their Messiah that they had always been waiting for. He envisioned a future where the Mosian communities could be accepted as full churches and granted the rights of churches, just like the Catholic or Lutheran or Calvinist churches of his time. But what Kant did criticize and what he was an enemy of, once again, was making religion about following certain laws and commandments and rituals that don't come from reason, and that our reason can't understand why we should have to do them, why they should have to be necessary, but rather making religion superstitious like that, like Kant would call it, making it about following rituals and commandments that have been passed down and revealed, and therefore making religion about following what scholars, what theologians, what, in the case of the Jews, the rabbis tell you to do. And that is what Kant would criticize, but that he would criticize in all communities of faith. So that isn't criticism that goes exclusively against the Jews, but when it comes to this, he would criticize everyone who had a superstitious religion. But moving on, when it comes to the laws in the state, Kant would say that the laws should be as simple and as few and as much based on common sense as possible. And he complained that there were too many laws, meaning that a common citizen could not know all the laws in the state. So a common citizen has to follow certain laws, to not break certain laws without even knowing them. So he can never be completely sure if he's doing everything as he's supposed to, or if unknowingly he's breaking some law. And I might add, Kant complained about this in the 18th century. He would probably have been shocked and appalled at seeing the tremendous amount of laws and bureaucracy we have amassed nowadays. I mean, even the experts, even the jurists who studied the laws, can't possibly know all of them, or even a majority of them. They still have to focus on specific parts of the law. Some jurists may focus and specialize in marital law, and someone may specialize in criminal law, and so on, but it's just too much. And therefore, the experts, the jurists, the people who did study law, they are needed, but they shouldn't be, Kant says. Some laws I can know from common sense because they are simply laws that reason itself gives. Like, for example, I know that I should not kill anyone or that I should not steal. I've never opened a German law book and explicitly read that stealing is forbidden. And since I didn't study law, I couldn't tell you where exactly you would find that law saying that you must not steal. But still, I know that stealing is forbidden in Germany. And it's just common sense that this is forbidden. And Kant would say that as much as possible, the laws should be reduced to these rational, these common sense laws, so that you don't require heaps of experts who have studied law to tell you what you can't and what you can do. And likewise in medicine, to know all the illnesses and with all their symptoms, and to know all the possible medicines and remedies, and to know all about your anatomy, you need an expert. Not everyone can study medicine. But how to live a healthy life, that is largely a matter of common sense. If I just listen to my body, and if I avoid extremes, if I practice temperance, I will probably avoid a lot of problems, avoid a lot of illnesses. If I just listen to my body, to what it needs, what it is hungry for, what movements, what stances feel good for my body and what hurt it, then I will largely not need the physician. And here, this is not just about Aufklärung. This is also a social issue, an issue of poverty and of wealth, because Kant was concerned with the fact that medical treatment is expensive. If you need surgeries, if you need certain pharmaceutical products, certain drugs, certain remedies, that costs you money. So medicine, therefore, Kant would say, is largely a privilege of the wealthy. And this very much still is an issue, especially in countries that don't have a good health system and a good health insurance like the United States. And therefore, also because of social concerns, because of concerns for the pure, Kant didn't want the health of the people to just be a matter of the experts that need to be paid, but rather he wanted the health of the people to, as much as possible, be in the hands of the people themselves, because keeping a healthy lifestyle, a healthy diet, staying away from whatever may harm my body is much less expensive and much more doable, even if you are poor, than buying expensive drugs or having expensive surgery done. Now let's move on to the second characteristic of the faculties. Since the higher faculties basically tell the people, you need us, you need the experts, you need to be unaufklärt and blindly follow us, while only the philosophical faculty tells the people, no, you can be aufklärt, you can think for yourselves, you can rely on yourselves. One could be so naive to assume that the people would be happy about hearing that, and the people would be grateful for that, and celebrate philosophy for that. But that, of course, would only be the case if the people were aufklärt, or if the people wanted to be aufklärt. That, however, very often is not the case. They want to be dependent. They want to not think for themselves, not be responsible for themselves, but to give it into the hands of others. And here we can find that what philosophy says, the advice that philosophy gives to the people, is mainly a negative advice. So philosophy is just telling the people what not to do. Don't be evil, then you don't need to fear God and hell. Don't be unjust, then you don't need to fear the state and fear prison if you live in a just state. Don't harm your body with an unhealthy lifestyle, then you don't need the physician. Again, if you are otherwise healthy, if you didn't catch some special sickness or were born with some sickness or whatever, but in the normal case. That is pretty simple advice and pretty clear advice. But that is exactly the problem. That is what people don't want to hear. And I've made this experience many, many times in my life, that you can give someone very clear and very simple and very wise advice that, if followed, would at once solve all and every problems that that person has, but still they don't want to listen. Or rather, they may say, yeah, I know that already. Can't you tell me anything more? Can't you tell me anything I don't know? If you are so smart, if you have read so much, if you have studied so much, you need to be able to tell me more than I already know. Well, you claim to already know this advice, but still you seem to not follow it, or else you wouldn't have these problems. But that is what people expect from the scholar, from the studied person, from the expert. They expect him to have some special knowledge that they themselves don't have, or else they would say his expertise, his studying was useless. So they expect that it isn't about just thinking rationally for oneself, but that special expert knowledge is needed, and they want to hear that expert knowledge. And the members of the higher faculties, because they are studied experts, can appear with more pride, with more grandeur, with more arrogance. They can look more impressive. While I, as a philosopher, who may have studied, but who only tells the people whatever doesn't require studying, but what they could know and understand themselves if just they reflected, I appear more of an equal. I appear much less impressive. And often people will dismiss you simply for that, for not being a special expert. So I've found that you can tell someone, well, this or that seems to be seems to not feel good, seems to feel uncomfortable for you, seems to hurt your body. So don't do it. It's not healthy for you. Pain exists for a reason. It's a warning signal of the body. So if you have, for example, if your muscles are sore and aching, you stress them too much. You did too much sports all at once, whatever. Take it more easy. Then the person will probably answer, "Oh, are you a doctor to know that?" No, I'm not a physician. I'm someone who listens to his body and who uses common sense to realize pain is a signal of the body saying, please don't do it like that. Please don't overdo it. You are doing too much. Or here where I live in an area with many immigrants who mainly consider themselves Muslims. I had many instances teaching at school, dealing with some young students, where I would tell some, I don't know, 12, 13-year-old who was angry, who was throwing a fit, who was throwing insults or about to get into a fight with someone. Then I may tell them, this is not how you should act. This is not what God made you for. God doesn't just want you to follow certain arbitrary rules like don't eat pork, pray on Fridays, or whatever. But rather, God wants you to act good. And I could even add that this is what the Quran directly says. That it says God loves those who act beautifully, or that it says those who believe in God will know no anger. And instead of listening to those words and letting those words get into his heart, instead of thinking about those words, because I mean, even if that wasn't written down explicitly in the Quran, it would still be very much evident that this is the truth, that this is how a person should be. But it even is written in the Quran. But instead, the student would immediately go, where is that written? You have to give me the exact verse and line. And if I can't do that, because I know what the Quran says generally, I have read it several times, and I remember the important sayings, but I haven't bothered to learn and to memorize all the exact lines, then that's immediately dismissed because clearly I'm no expert. Yeah? Then the student might tell me, well, my Hodja has memorized the whole Quran. Well, that's nice for your Hodja, but clearly your Hodja is not living the Quran because your Hodja has not taught you to do so. And your Hodja himself probably often gets angry, and when you are too loud in class, he screams at you to be silent. And when you are asking critical questions, he screams at you. So that's good for him if he has memorized the line that says that the truly religious person, the true believer, will not know any anger. But clearly, memorizing it didn't do much good for him. But the main problem here, Kant would say, is that the three higher faculties, while philosophy is only giving negative advice, telling people what not to do, they claim to have positive advice or positive remedies with which they can help people once things have gotten messed up. And that is exactly what people expect from the experts, Kant would say. He says that people go to the experts, to the scholars, as if they were magicians, expecting them to have almost supernatural powers to solve their problems, saying, well, this is what you have studied for, isn't it? Why do you have studied? Why do you have read and learned so much if you can't now solve my problems with that? And so the simple truth is that people, they don't want to be good. They want to hate their neighbor. They want to be assholes to their colleagues and to their wife. They want to mistreat and abuse their children. They want to live a lifestyle of wealth and luxury here in the West, drive around in their car, fly around on vacation, buy new clothes, buy new phones all the time, and not think about how that is harming people in other parts of the world who have to produce these things, or how that is harming the environment, how that is harming God's creation. And then they want to go to the priest, and they want the priest to tell them how they can still go to heaven. How all they have to do is confess and pray some Hail Marys, or how all they have to do is go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. They will, of course, take a plane and thereby once again ruin the climate. And they will have to go to Mecca. They will have to go to Saudi Arabia and thereby support an inhumane, despotic dictatorship, suppressing its own people, killing and torturing people. But all that is fine because you just do the pilgrimage and then all your sins are forgiven. And likewise, they don't want to be just. What they want is to not pay taxes. What they want is to cheat and to commit fraud and to ignore the traffic laws. And what they want is to mistreat their workers if they are employers, to make them work harder than the law says, or to pay them less than the law says. And then they want the jurist, the advocate, to help them get away with it and not go to prison. And what they want is, they don't want to live healthy. They want to live an unhealthy lifestyle. They want to take drugs. They want to fuck around and have unprotected sex. They want to stress themselves till they have a burnout and psychological issues. They want to eat junk food. And then they want to go to the physician and have him fix it up. And that's why they don't want a philosopher simply telling them, well, the wisest thing to do is don't break it, then it doesn't need any fixing. They want to break it, and then they want some expert with magical powers to fix everything up for them. I'm moving on to the third characteristic, the third difference. That is about power. Kant would point out that the three higher faculties all have power. They all command. The theologian tells you what you have to do because God wants you to do it. The jurist tells you what you have to do because the state wants you to do it. And the physician tells you what you have to do for your health. All of them have power, and the philosopher is the only one of them who doesn't have any special power or authority. He simply speaks with the voice of reason. But on the other hand, Kant would also say that philosophy is more free than the other three. because yes, they do have power, but they are also under power. They are also ruled over by certain powers. The theologian can't freely think or reflect about religion and about God. He has to be in line with whatever his church, whatever his tradition says. And the jurist, of course, has to enforce or has to work with the laws of his state. He can't just say, well, I don't like this law, I think it's a nonsensical law, so I will ignore it, I will now create my own new law, but rather he is a servant of his state. The physician, Kant would say, out of these three has the most freedom. And here I will also stress that the conflict between philosophy and medicine is more of a sideshow for Kant. It makes up the shortest of the three essays in the conflict of faculties, and it's also the only of the three conflicts that outside of this one book Kant barely ever addresses, while the other two conflicts with the other two faculties are also addressed in other texts at length. Kant would say that medicine, being close to natural science, which after all to him is applied philosophy, is closest to the philosophical faculty. And out of the three higher faculties, the one of medicine surely is the one which has the most freedom. But even so, Kant would still say that the physician is under certain laws. In the state, there are certain laws concerning health, concerning public health, and concerning which remedies, which drugs are allowed, which need prescription, which are freely available. So even so, he's not completely free. And the fact that the higher faculties both have power, but also are unfree, are ruled over by power, is only a contradiction if you look at it superficially, because that is indeed the nature of power. Power, far from granting you freedom, rather makes you unfree. Power is a shackle. I mean, just consider I, for example, who doesn't have any power, I can speak pretty much freely, and if I had certain power, if I was a politician or a diplomat, I would have to choose my words more carefully. For example, as I record this just some days ago, the president of Iran crashed with his helicopter. And, well, I can say that I'm certainly not sad about his death. I can say that he was a criminal, that he was a tyrant, and had he lived, he should have gone to the Hague. If I was the chancellor or the foreign minister, even though Germany certainly is not in a close and friendly relationship with Iran, I still couldn't just say this as I just did so freely. True Aufklärung, Fichte would say, is about having the courage to not be a slave nor a master. True freedom comes only when you let others be free too, when you have no power. And this is exactly the role in which Kant sees the philosopher. The philosopher should only be concerned with truth, with finding truth. The motto of the philosopher could be the old saying, fiat veritas et pereat mundus, meaning let there be truth, even if the world may perish over it. But that is a statement that can only be taken up as someone's motto if you are not part of that world. It is the motto of an outsider. And it has always been the outsider who could speak truth, who could look at the truth, look for what even is true, and then speak the truth more freely. I mean, in the fairy tale, it is the child who says that the emperor is naked. The emperor's ministers also see that he's naked, but they dare not say so. They dare not admit it. The child, however, who is completely powerless, who is not really part of society yet, the child can dare to speak freely. And outside of fairy tales, in real life, we could see the same. A child had to come along, a 15-year-old girl, and a girl with autism, with Asperger's syndrome, and had to say that our house is on fire and that we need to do something about it. All the adults, all the grown-ups, all the people in power could not and would not and did not dare to speak so freely. And even most climate scientists didn't speak as freely as Greta Thunberg did. They probably did so amongst themselves or behind closed doors, but publicly, most of them tried to tone it down. Most of them tried to not sound too alarmist, worrying that they would not be taken seriously, worrying that people would not listen to them if they sounded too extreme. But Greta Thunberg, being a child with Asperger's, had no such worries. She simply said it as it was. She wouldn't be censored, even when her dad told her she had to tone it down and tried to force her to change her speech that she was giving before the UN Secretary General. She would not listen to the grown-up, but go with what she had to say. So once again, I said that before 2 lectures ago, I can say here that Greta Thunberg comes closer to what a philosopher should be to Kant, at least in the world sense. She's certainly not a metaphysician, but in the world sense, as a lawgiver and as someone who is free and freely speaks the truth, comes closer to what a philosopher should be according to Kant than our regular professors do. What she is doing is what Foucault called, with an ancient Greek term, parrhesia. That is, speaking frankly and speaking truthfully and speaking truth to power, freely criticizing power. And that is exactly what, according to Kant, is the job of the philosopher. But it is something that can only be done by an outsider, by someone who himself is powerless and who is not part of the web of society and the web of power. Therefore, it is very important for Kant that philosophy, that the philosophical faculty, stays independent. And when I'm speaking of the faculty of philosophy here, you always have to keep in mind that for Kant, that's not limited to metaphysics, but rather it includes natural science. So, of course, courageous and principled natural scientist, someone like Kevin Anderson, can also fill this role of being a parrhesiastis and speaking truth to power. But what is always required for that is a certain independence. Today we consider it a great achievement of the era of Aufklärung that religion and state were separated. And to be sure, that is an achievement, and that is something that Kant also advocated for. Um, but he would say that we don't just need a separation of religion and state, we also need a separation of philosophy, or rather science in general, we could say today, and state. And that is indeed something Kant would say that was the case in ancient Greece, and that to him is the reason why philosophy could strive there. He says that in ancient Egypt, what philosophy, what wisdom, what science there was too closely connected with the priesthood and with the state cult. While in China, philosophy, in the form of mainly Confucianism, was too closely connected to the state bureaucracy. So, if we go with the faculties, we could probably say that in Egypt, philosophy was in the hands of the theologians, while in China, it was in the hands of the jurists. And only in Europe, only in Greece, Kant would say, was it actually free? Was it actually independent of the state? Of course, not always. There were times during the Middle Ages and beyond that when philosophy was intertwined with theology and with religion in Europe. But in modernity, there came a new emancipation, and especially in Kant's age, in the age of Aufklärung, philosophy once again became independent, and that is when it thrived. And that is, he would say, how it should be. Of course, even in later times, it has not always been that way. Whenever a certain ideology rises to power, philosophy and science cannot be free. So in the communist states, all philosophy and all sciences and, for example, history, of course, had to be Marxist. And of course, under the Nazis, fields like history or the study of language or biology had to serve the ideology and had to serve the race theory of the ideology. That is not how it should be. There should be a separation. But this, to Kant, has to go both ways. Not just must philosophy or science not be ruled over by the state, it must also not rule the state. So here Kant is not in agreement with Plato, who envisioned the wise philosopher king ruling over society. Kant was very, very far from wanting that. Because he would basically say, well, a philosopher can't be king. The moment you would make a philosopher king, he would stop being a philosopher. Kant once says that power always clouds your judgment. If you want to judge, if you want to think about truth freely, and that is what the philosopher's job is, you have to be powerless. So Kant doesn't demand rulership, and this once again proves what I said 2 lectures ago, that when Kant says the philosopher should be a lawgiver of reason, he certainly doesn't mean it in a literal sense, saying the philosopher should make actual laws and have power to enforce them, but rather it can only be meant in the way that he points out the way, and the people should listen to what he has to say, which, if they are not forced to do, they will only do if they themselves are philosophers enough, they themselves are wise enough to understand that he is really saying what is true and rational. So Kant is not demanding power and rulership for philosophy. All he is demanding is freedom. This is exactly why he is demanding freedom of speech, freedom of thought. I will talk about this more in a later lecture when I talk about his whole concept of Aufklärung. But this is why he wants this freedom. So that philosophy, so that science can freely tell the truth. And he doesn't expect them to directly rule, but what he does ask for is that the people in power, and to be sure, back then those were mainly the princes of Europe, but nowadays, since we live in a democracy, we would have to say that that is everyone, because everyone is in power. What Kant does want is that the people in power listen to the philosopher and what he has to say, that they consider it and that they take it seriously. Because, of course, it's not enough if the philosopher has the freedom to speak his mind but is just ignored or laughed at. No, he should be listened to and taken seriously. And here I might make a side note. I would say that we can distinguish three kinds of societies if we go by how aufklärt a society is. First, there would be a society that is largely too unaufklärt to find its way on its own. And when someone wise appears to warn that society that it is on a wrong path and to point that society back on the right path, then the society of this first type, because it is so unaufklärt, will not listen to this wise warner. If anything, they will laugh at him or they will even kill him. The second type of society would still be too unaufklärt to find its own way, but would at least be aufklärt enough to recognize wisdom when it appears and to listen to it. So when the warner appears, this society will listen to him and change its ways. Just like the people of Nineveh in the Bible listened when Jonah warned them of God's judgment and saved their city by changing their ways. And third, you would have the fully aufklärt society, where people are not just wise enough to recognize when someone else is wiser than them and to listen to him, but rather where all the people are so wise that they don't need special wise people, special warners, special philosophers anymore. Well, if these are the three types of society according to their Aufklärtness, then one would have to make the rather pessimistic assertion that so far there's hardly been any progress in human history. Because far from having reached the third state, we in thousands of years have not even reached the second state. And everything that we do consider progress, our advancements in technology and medicine and so on, pales in the face of this. Because in the face of this, it turns out that we have barely progressed at all since ancient times. I mean, you only have to look at the Bible. The Bible, the Old Testament, again and again, tells of warners. Back then, they were not called philosophers, they were called prophets, but their function is the same. They are doing parrhesia, they are speaking truth to power, they are doing criticism, and they are warning. And these prophets often are outsiders. They are foreigners or a simple shepherd like Amos. comes forth to warn the people and to warn the king that they are on a wrong path. It is not the temple prophets whose job it is to be prophets and to prophesize. It is not the scholars of the scriptures. So it is not the theologians in Kant's language who are these warners, who are these prophets, but it is often outsiders. And what happens is they warn that the people of Israel are on a bad path, that they are sinners, that they are serving idols and wrong gods, and that they are doing evil, they are mistreating the widows and the orphans, they are being unjust, and the people don't listen, and therefore they get punished. Therefore, God sends the Assyrians and the Babylonians to conquer them and to destroy their kingdom, to destroy their temple. But just like in the Bible, these warners, these prophets are not listened to, we also hardly listened in more modern times to our warners. Kant wasn't listened to, and therefore we had the Napoleonic Wars, we had the 2 World Wars. Fichte wasn't listened to, and therefore we had imperialism and colonialism. We had and still have the exploitation of man and of nature, and we have the widespread neurosis and lostness and unhappiness and meaninglessness of people that people are suffering from. Nietzsche wasn't listened to, and therefore we had fascism. And nowadays we can witness how the prophet of our times, how Greta Thunberg, is not listened to either. And God knows what terrible consequences that will bring, and already is bringing. And I myself, I don't just come with my own warning. I come to, in this history of philosophy, where right now I'm speaking about Kant, but in the future I also want to speak about others as well. I come to once again remind people of the old warnings that were spoken before. Just like in the Quran, Muhammad reminds the people of the old prophets that came before him and how they were warners, just like he is, and what happened to the people who didn't listen to them, like the people of Sodom who didn't listen to Lot, or like the Pharaoh and the Egyptians who didn't listen to Moses. And you can't force Aufklärung onto people. Aufklärung is about thinking for yourself. You can't force someone to think for themselves. They have to do that for themselves. But what you can do, what you can force people, is to become guilty. You can at least tell them the truth. Whether they accept it or not is another question. You can only warn them, and they either listen to your warning or they don't. But if they don't, then you have taken one thing from them, and that is the ability to later on excuse themselves by saying, oh, we didn't know any better. Nobody told us. How could we have known? If we had known that what we did was bad, we wouldn't have done it. No. That, if nothing else, I want to take away from people. And I might add, that is why these warners are hated so much, and why they have always been persecuted, why so many of them have been attacked and slandered and even killed. Clearly, this can't just be about not wanting to listen to them, because then it would be enough to simply ignore them or to make fun of them. But people, even if it's not conscious, even if it's unconscious, they do sense that once they have listened to this warning, once they have heard this warning, they still have the choice to be good or evil, but they can't be evil in an innocent way anymore. They are now guilty if they choose evilness, because now it really is a choice. It is not simply something done mindlessly because they don't know any better anymore. And that is what they often hate the warner and the prophet for, and that is why they often attack and persecute the prophet and try to kill him. But I also have another remark to make. If, like me, you study philosophology today, you might often hear people asking you, and this doesn't just go for philosophology, this goes for many subjects, for pretty much anything that is called humanities nowadays. You might have people asking you, well, what's the use of that? Why are you wasting your time with that? Or what do you want to even do with that? How do you want to make money with that? The joke here goes that all you can do when studying philosophology is become a taxi driver. Now, you should have humor. You should not be humorless. Um, so I don't feel particularly offended or annoyed by that. Even though I would say humor is fine and good, but it should be original. You should not just repeat the same old dad jokes that have been told for decades and that you didn't come up with, but just heard others use and reuse. But that aside, I don't particularly mind when someone says something like that. But if it's just a joke, that's fine. But I do think that it can often be an expression of something deeper, of a stance that I do consider quite dangerous. Yes, that I do consider fascist even. And that is the ideology that the utilitarian ideology that everything has to be useful and that everyone has to work in the sense of contributing to the economy, contributing to the working class, contributing to the Volksgemeinschaft. That there always has to be more. It always has to go forward, and there can't ever be anyone who stops in the tracks and looks around and thinks and reflects and questions things. That this is forbidden. You must not stop and look around. You must work. You must contribute. I say woe to the society that doesn't spare some space for people who are, so to say, useless, who are not contributing through their work directly to that society as it is, but rather who question if it should be like that and if the work of the people should contribute to this society or if rather the society should be changed. People like this are needed, and these are the philosophers. And I talked about fascism. I know that this is a word that is overused nowadays, and it is a word that is mainly used in politics as a tool of defamation against your enemies, against the people you don't like. And therefore, the people has become very meaningless, and many people will not like hearing it because they are used by now to it being thrown around carelessly. But I'm a philosopher. I assure you that I don't use such words and terms carelessly. When I say fascist, I don't just mean thing that I don't like and that I want to demonize. When I say fascist, that has a clear meaning in my mind. And I believe that fascism is largely about this utilitarian ideology that only believes in usefulness and saying everything and everyone has to be useful, has to contribute to the greater good. And if you don't do that, then you are useless, then you are a parasite, and then you need to go. And here I would like to just point out how obsessed the right is with work. At least that is here in Germany. I don't have too deep knowledge of the slogans they like to throw around in other languages. But here they are very much obsessed with work and with hard work. And I find it curious that all of their enemies are constantly accused of not working hard enough. So some time ago, when we had the big financial crisis and the big euro crisis, and Greece was in debt, and Germany paid a lot of loans, you would hear a lot about how lazy the Greek people are and how they are not hardworking as we Germans. And then some years later, when so many refugees from Syria and other countries came here, you would hear a lot about how they should go back to their countries and work harder to improve their lives there, or to rebuild their war-torn countries, because we had also worked hard and rebuilt our country after the war and created a functioning and thriving economy. And then nowadays, when there are climate activists, the trope is always that these activists are all university students, which, by the way, is empirically wrong. There are many older people amongst the activists too, but the trope is they are just students, and they are not working. And in the last years, there has been this prominent group calling itself the last generation, blocking streets, gluing itself to streets and blocking the traffic. And the right has been furious and keeps talking about how these lazy students are blocking hardworking people who just want to drive to work. And of course, when they want to attack certain politicians, they also will stress how these politicians never worked a day in their life, how they went straight from university into politics, which, to be sure, is true in the case of many politicians, but it is true across the board. And it is curious that only leftist and green politicians get accused of this, when it is true for many right-wing politicians as well. But you see this obsession with work, this belief that only those people who do a useful work are only they matter, only they are worthy, and everyone else who is not doing useful work, not contributing to society, but probably disrupting the workflow of society, is evil, is a parasite. And to that, I can only say that driving trains full of Jews to Auschwitz is also hard work. And that I wish there had been some people decades ago who had glued themselves on the railways. Maybe some atrocities could then have been prevented. And that's why I become, well, at least very uneasy when some people only ascribe value to natural science or engineering or whatever, and would like to remove the so-called humanities from universities altogether. People with that sort of mindset and that sort of stance always at least have fascist tendencies. And if they have their way, that is a sure way to create a society that is not self-critical anymore. A society that has no warners, no one who tells all those good, hardworking people contributing to that society that maybe their work is misplaced, that maybe their hard work should go into something else. But I want to go back a bit to Kant and question one thing about his conception of the of philosophy. I do very much agree that yes, philosophy should be free, and the job of the philosopher should be to criticize, should be to do parrhesia. I would just question if this can really be done by the philosophical faculty, because as a faculty, it is still part of the university system, and as a faculty and as part of this university, it thereby is still under the power of the state. And so I wonder if the true philosopher can really be one, as long as he is part of the faculty of philosophy. And if we look at history, we find that, of course, there has been a brief time in the 18th century in Germany, in Kant's lifetime, when there was more room, so to say, for philosophy at the universities. And when people like Kant, like Fichte, like Schelling, like Hegel did teach at the university. But then that was a very brief, very special time where actual Aufklärung was happening. And even then, we find that the philosophers, if they spoke too freely, could get in trouble and could face the danger of losing their position at the university. That is, I talked about this a little in the lecture on Kant's life. That is what happened to Christian Wolff, who had dared to say that the Chinese could be moral and could have a good moral philosophy and could be virtuous, even without Christianity and even without natural religion. Wolff had to leave his professorship in Halle. That is what happened to Fichte, who was accused of atheism and had to leave his professorship in Jena. And even Kant himself, as I talked about, did come into conflict with the Prussian censorship over his writings on religion. So, and if we look beyond the age of Aufklärung, we find that many, pretty much all of the great philosophers, be it Descartes or Leibniz or Spinoza or Nietzsche, did not teach at university. I mean, Nietzsche did, but only for a brief time when he was younger, and only as a philologist, not as a philosopher. And this goes on into today's time. I don't know of any philosopher anywhere who's currently teaching at any university. The only contemporary philosophers I can think of that I would really consider philosophers are my dad and myself. Both no professors at university. And I very consciously, pretty early on, decided not to try and have an academic career, because I didn't feel there was a place for me there. Of course, nowadays there is no such official censorship. Of course, nowadays there is academic freedom and freedom of speech. but still there are certain restrictions, and not just ideological restrictions in the closer sense. So that might also be somewhat a problem. I mean, where I studied here in Berlin, we got a paper with questions where we had to rate the class at the end of each class, and that included such questions as is the teacher there on time? Does he take teaching seriously, and so on. But it also included a question whether the teacher uses politically correct language. And if all the students would say no, he is not speaking as the woke ideology demands him to speak, he might get into some trouble with the faculty. But what I would consider even more important is simply the fact that there is a certain canon of topics or of opinions that you can have or that you can deal with. And if you don't go with that, if you go your own way, it might be possible to find your niche, but it is certainly difficult. In order to have a career there, in order to eventually become a professor, you need to have your papers published in the important journals. You need to have your papers quoted by other people. You need to go to conferences. And therefore, you most of the time have to deal with whatever is fashionable right now. Whatever philosophers are fashionable right now, whatever topics are fashionable right now. So you have to deal, for example, with questions of AI and consciousness and neurobiology, or you have to deal with questions of gender studies and identity, ethics, and so on. And if you want to focus on topics or thinkers that nowadays are more obscure, you will probably have a harder time. And also, at least if you are not a full fledged professor, the way it works, at least that's how it worked here where I studied. Other universities or especially other countries may work a bit differently. But here the system was that the teachers had to turn in proposals for classes they wanted to teach every semester. And you can only turn in a limited number of proposals, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 proposals. And if they are turned down, you can't make a new proposal for that semester, but only half a year later again. So if your proposals are turned down, you basically have no job and no income for half a year. And that will, of course, lead to a sort of self-censorship. That will, of course, lead people to not experiment, to not be a little more out there or daring, but to always go with what is safe, to go with what they know will be accepted as a seminar. And I remember one example. I had one teacher who had proposed a class which really wasn't, if you ask me, a very outrageous topic or anything. He had proposed a class on Socrates and Jesus. He had wanted to compare the two and to compare their ethics and to compare their idea of love. But it was turned down because apparently the philosophical faculty of the Freie Universität Berlin thinks that Jesus doesn't belong into philosophy, and that you can't look at Jesus and what the Bible says about Jesus from a philosophical perspective. And if even such a completely harmless and if you ask me, quite interesting class like that is turned down, you can imagine how much else would be turned down. So that is why I disagree with Kant. Not that this is the job of the philosopher, but I disagree that the philosopher can do his job as part of the university. And that is why I try to go my own path. And time will tell if that will be possible, if there will be people listening here, if I will be allowed, so to say, to speak more freely here. And of course, if I will be able to live from that, if I will get some support via Patreon or coffee or PayPal or whatever, or make some money from my books, so that I can support myself doing philosophy here. But I very firmly believe that I could not do my philosophy at the academy. But I move on to the fourth and last difference between the four faculties, or between the three higher faculties and the lower faculty, and that is morality. Because if we look at their conflict once again, I said that the higher faculties represent empiricism, experience, scholarship, expertise in things that you have to learn and to study, while philosophy represents rationalism, thinking for yourself. Well, what is it that you can know for yourself without having first to study? It is what you ought to do. Because what is the case, what is true, that is something you need to examine and observe and experiment on. Here, study is needed. But knowing what you ought to do, knowing what your duty is, that only requires thinking. And so it follows naturally that the position of the faculty of philosophy is the position of the moral law. So let's once again revise the three conflicts. The theologian would tell you that being a good person is not good enough for God. God also requires you to be a member in the right club and not in the wrong club. God also requires you to believe certain histories of what allegedly happened in the past, what miracles allegedly happened. And God also requires you to do certain cult rituals to please him. Well, philosophy would say no. Reason says all that is required of you is being good and following your conscience. And if you are conscientious, if you are following what your conscience tells you, that will be good enough for God. Then you don't have to fear hell. And likewise, the jurist and the politician will insist that humans are evil, humans are bad, and have to be treated accordingly. And there can't ever be true progress. We can't ever get truly better. It is naive to believe in the possibility of world peace, for example, and that's why politics should not strive to create world peace. It should strive to defeat its enemies and to seek its own advancement. But the philosopher will say, well, reason tells us that we should have peace and freedom, and therefore we must believe that it is possible, that it can be achieved, because clearly it is our duty to achieve it. And likewise, the physician will treat the human being as a biological machine which might break, which might have some issues, but that is a question completely removed from morality. Getting sick is not something you get for being immoral, and getting better again is achieved through surgery, through medicines, and not through morality. While on the other hand, the philosopher will say that, of course, part of your health is about the body and its functions, but still, morality does play a role in health. If you act morally, that is, if you act truly as a rational being should, if you act with dignity, um, if you act with temperance and with a certain stoicism, you cannot rule your body, but you can at least govern your body and thereby influence it. I will add here that Kant separates all the duties humans have into duties against others and duties against ourselves. And he also at the same time distinguished between the more narrow duties of rights or of justice, which are about not hurting someone's rights, not getting in their way, so to speak, and the wider duties of virtue, which are about helping someone. I will talk more about this, what this actually means, how this distinction actually works, when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. But here I want to say that one could probably say that according to Kant's thinking, if you do your duties of justice against yourself, you will largely stay healthy. And if you do your duties of justice against other people, you will, once again, if you don't live in some despotic state, but in a just state, you will not get into trouble or into conflict with the law. And then I would say, if you are virtuous altogether, that is, if you do not just your duties of justice, but also your wider duties, your duties of love against others and yourself, then you deserve heaven, and then you have nothing to fear from God. With that, I am nearing the end of this long lecture, and therefore also the end of all the lectures on what philosophy means to Kant. But I want to do one more overview of what I said here. And when we do that overview, we find that I went along Kant's table of categories. This is not something I tried to do. This is not something that happened on purpose. I myself, when writing my book on Kant, only realized that after the fact, so to say. But that to me is only proof that it was done correctly. Now, what the table of categories actually is and means, I will address in a future lecture. For now, I just will say that all our thinking, according to Kant, is done along 12 categories, which are grouped into 4 groups of 3. And these 4 groups are the categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. And the differences between the higher faculties and the lower faculty that I just talked about can also be described along these 4 groups. So we could say that when it comes to quantity, the difference is that the teachings of philosophy have universality because they come out of reason, while the teachings of the 3 higher faculties only have limited truth. And also, the teachings of philosophy are open to anyone who is aufklärt enough to think for himself, while the teachings of the 3 higher faculties are limited to a few experts who actually studied this. Secondly, if we look at the quality, we can find that philosophy's teachings are largely negative, telling us what not to do, so to not cause ourselves problems, while the 3 higher faculties promise positive teachings or positive remedies to fix our problems once we have caused them. And when it comes to relation, we find that the three higher faculties have power over the lay people, but are themselves subject to the state to some degree, or to whatever authority they have to serve, while philosophy alone is free and can not give orders, but also doesn't have to follow orders. And largely, when it comes to modality, we find that what philosophy tells us, what we should do, is necessary because it is the general moral law that is speaking. It is necessary, for example, to not kill. While what the higher faculties tell us we should do, for example, when the theologian tells us we should pray eastward or westward, or we should not eat this or that food, those commandments, since they don't come from reason, are not necessary. They are arbitrary. They are contingent. Well, why does this whole topic of the conflict of faculties matter? And why did I talk about it that extensively? Two reasons. For one, I think it matters because it can help tremendously in understanding Kant. That is, not simply understanding particular parts of his philosophy, like understanding his theory of cognition or understanding his theory of morals, but rather understanding his philosophy as a whole, understanding his project of philosophy, understanding what he wanted to achieve through his philosophy. Because if we look at Kant's idea of what is a philosopher and what should the philosopher do, what is the job of the philosopher or of the faculty of philosophy, and if we then read his various texts, his essays, his books, we can find that almost everything he has written was in service of this. So one could say that ultimately the purpose of his philosophical work is to assure that the philosopher can become, or can stay what I have described him as in this lecture. So one could say that Kant's political writings, Kant's writings directed at a broader audience, that what Kant says about freedom of speech in essays such as his essay on the question what is Aufklärung, or the essay on what it means to orient oneself in thinking. These political writings, one could say, are about the third characteristic of the philosophical faculty. They are about the freedom. And Kant is advocating for the freedom of philosophy and the freedom of science to freely study and freely question and freely criticize and to be heard. And I would argue that his critical writings, so his three critiques, which are not directed at a broader and also non-scholarly public, but which are directed at the experts, at the scholars, and that is mainly at the metaphysicians, so at the philosophers in the school sense. I would argue that these writings are about the other three characteristics of philosophy. So as far as the first characteristic, the one of quantity, is concerned, Kant is basically saying in his critiques, don't abandon rationalism, don't abandon reason just because so far it didn't work to, for example, prove God or the immortality of the soul with reason. Don't become merely empiricist. That is what natural science does, and it gets quite far through experience. But in philosophy, we do have to be rationalist. We do have to rely on reason. But then, if we look at the second characteristic, the one of quantity, Kant in his critiques basically is acknowledging that the criticism of the empiricists toward the rationalists is correct, that rationalism in philosophy, in metaphysics, the way it has been done so far, didn't work. We didn't prove God. We didn't prove freedom. We didn't prove that we are immortal. So, therefore, he is saying, stay rationalist, keep being rationalist, but you have to shift your aim, so to speak. Metaphysics is not a positive science. It is not a science that can bring us new knowledge. And whenever you try to do that, you will fail, or you will just talk yourself into having proven something, but you won't actually prove it. Rather, understand that your job as a philosopher, as a metaphysician, is mainly a negative one. It's mainly to prevent errors. It's mainly to show which ways are the wrong ways, but it is not to prove a positive truth. And then this leads directly to the fourth characteristic, that is the one of modality. That leads to Kant saying, well, if in philosophy, in metaphysics, we should be rationalists, but if through rationality alone we cannot find a positive truth, we can only work negatively, then we should shift our focus from trying to be theoretical scientists, from just doing speculation, trying to find theoretical truth, to being practical scientists. Then we should remember that the true vocation of the philosopher is not just to be a schoolman, but to be a wise man and the lawgiver of reason. That is, philosophy should focus less on theoretical metaphysics and more on practical moral philosophy. So, with that, I hope to have shown that this conflict of faculties can teach us what philosophy's true job, true vocation is, according to Kant, and that in turn can teach us what Kant wanted to achieve with his writings, and therefore it can give us a frame through which to understand all of Kant's writings. But I said there's one more reason why I wanted to talk about this topic, and that is because I think it is a topic that still has a lot of relevance in our current world. Because to be sure, the universities have since been reorganized. They are no longer limited to these four faculties. A lot more faculties, a lot more subjects have been added to the universities. But still, I would say that the various subjects, again and again, come into conflict with philosophy in the closer sense. And again, we can understand this conflict and what it is all about through the lens of Kant's writing on the conflict of the faculties of his time, and through these 4 characteristics I gave of the various faculties. And I want to conclude by showing you this through 4 examples. And I could probably come up with 1,000 examples, but I will just give 4 examples to show how this is still very much relevant nowadays. And then anyone listening to this can think for himself and come up with more examples by himself. So, first, the characteristic of quantity. Here I will point to the current ideology of political correctness and wokeness, which of course has also infested the universities and established itself there in certain subjects such as gender studies, post-colonial studies, critical race theory. And what we find is that with this ideology comes a certain opinion about morality. That opinion being that morality is not simply about being a good and decent human being. That is what Kant would say, and I will talk about this more when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. He says what matters in morality is only that you have a good will, that you have regard and reverence for the dignity and the freedom of every single human. But this woke ideology says, nay, that is not enough. It is not enough to simply be decent and to simply regard everyone and their freedom. Rather, you have to follow certain special rules of conduct. You have to avoid certain microaggressions. You have to avoid cultural appropriation. You have to avoid certain words. You have to, I don't know, say spokesperson instead of spokesman. You must not dress up as an Indian for Halloween, and you must not call them an Indian either. You must call them Native Americans. And what this does is turning morality into something that you can't get through merely thinking rationally, through merely using common sense, but rather it turns morality into a matter for the experts. Morality is now something that has to be learned. Goodwill and regard for your fellow human beings is no longer enough. You have to learn certain rules of conduct, like you had to learn, according to the theologian, certain commandments of God. And you now first have to, I don't know, to first go to a gender studies seminar, and you first have to learn about 100 different gender identities and dozens of different pronouns before you can be a good human being. And this means that morality is not something that you can have simply by being aufklärt and thinking for yourself. Rather the opposite, you have to be unaufklärt, because it can't be expected that every living person goes to a gender studies seminar or a critical race theory seminar. And therefore, the expectation must be that you turn off your own independent thinking and just blindly listen to the experts who tell you how to behave. And I might add that this, ironically, is quite racist. For all these people, as leftists, like to talk about equality and about fighting for marginalized groups, they are largely themselves privileged. I mean, those people sitting in those classes or holding those professorships are largely white people from well-off families, and they are speaking for less well-off or less well-educated people. I mean, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who visited an exhibition or something on colonialism, the German colonialism in Africa, and there were some texts there talking about people of color, and it was, however, written in the British spelling, so color with OU. And some girl who was there with him complained that this allegedly is racist. You have to write people of color in the American way, so color with just an O. And this girl, of course, was white. And I don't know if black people in Africa, in the countries that Germany had colonized up until World War One, if they will really care about this or even understand what this complaint is about. I mean, I hardly understand what it is about. And when these people, these woke experts on their new morality, when they make up all these rules for behavior and even for language, it is exactly marginalized people. It is people who don't have the wealth and who don't have the education to even understand what this is about. It is people who are immigrants who are excluded from this. And especially here in Germany, they are trying very hard to change the language, and they are making the language much more complicated to allegedly include women in the language. And I come from an area full of immigrants, and I have talked refugees coming freshly to German, not speaking a single word of German, and this is making German, and this is integrating into German society and into the German language much, much more harder. So this is racist. But moving on to the second point, to the characteristic of quality. Here I want to point towards our current ecological and climate crisis. Because here people behave exactly in the way Kant already described them behaving towards the experts. That is, people want to continue ruining the world. They want to continue driving around in their cars, flying around in their planes, eating their meat, buying fast fashion, and buying new products that they don't need and throwing it away. And then they demand that the experts come up with ways to fix the earth. They want experts to create ways to fish out the microplastics out of the oceans, or to find ways how to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere again. And when Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future would protest against us destroying the climate, I have again and again heard people accusing them of just complaining, but not offering solutions. And again and again, I have heard people saying that Thunberg, who once again is more of a philosopher than most people, that if she thinks she knows better than the politicians, that she should come up with what we should do. She should come up with some ways to fix everything. But the climate and ecological movement has already told us what to do. And long before Thunberg was even born, even over 30 years ago now, another courageous young girl, Seven Suzuki, already put it into words perfectly.
All this is happening before our eyes, and yet we act as if we have all the time we want and all the solutions. I'm only a child, and I don't have all the solutions. But I want you to realize, neither do you. You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up in a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forests that once grew where there is now a desert. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it.
But this negative advice people don't want to hear. They want to not have to stop. They want to continue as they did before. And then they want some positive means to fix everything magically. Moving on to the third distinction between the faculties, the distinction according to the relation, that is moving on to the topic of freedom. Here we can look at the economy, for example. Economists are experts on the current economy, and therefore they are not free. Their job is to serve some company or to serve some state and to serve the growth of that company or of that state. So their job is to work within the framework of the current capitalist system, of the current free market system, and in this framework to be successful. That is why I would say that economists have no clue about economy. If anything, they have a clue about how to use and be successful in the current economic system, but they have no clue about economy in general, and they don't study economy in general. And the philosopher, since he is free, since his job is not to make money and to achieve growth, economic growth, but just to think about the truth and about what ought to be, the philosopher can freely think about how should our economy function. And then when a philosopher comes up with a more rational way maybe to do the economy, like for example Fichte with his closed trade state, the economist will immediately dismiss it and say, that's nonsense, that's naive, that can't work. That's not how it is done. But what he is really saying is that can't work within the current system. So that can't work if everything else ought to stay the same. But the philosopher never claimed that it ought to stay the same. Here I'm remembering some article I read a while ago, which was about certain companies and startups that had the aim to not just be about profits and about growth and about benefiting their own CEO, but rather which have the aim to serve the common good and the commonwealth. And the article was about how, on the one hand, there are more and more such companies being created, but on the other hand, that leads to new problems or to new questions, because some of the founders or of the current leaders of such companies are concerned of the future. What if the founder of such a company dies, and then his heirs take over the company and transform it into a regular company serving their own gain, serving their own profit, and not serving society or the environment as the original founder had intended? Or what if it is a company that goes to the stock market, and then the shareholders take over power and make the company about their profits? Well, and therefore some such companies had come together and proposed a new law here in Germany, proposed to create a new sort of company, so that the founders or leaders of a company could ensure through law that the future leaders of that company, the future heirs or shareholders or whoever, could not just change the direction of the company, but would still have to uphold its original values. And now I don't want to talk about this law specifically, or whether that law in the way they proposed it was well thought out or not. What I found interesting in the article was that the German Ministry of Finance had the proposal be examined by its experts. And I mean, who were those experts? Presumably economists. And those experts ended up dismissing the proposal. And the article I read was quoting one of those experts. And he was saying our market economy is based on the idea that capital can move freely and is not bound to one course. And I mean, that is a correct statement if it is a statement about an is. So that is how our current capitalist market economy functions, indeed. But whoever said that we should stick to our current market economy and not change it? And that is a question for the philosopher. And that is a question that apparently the economist is unfit to answer or to even really consider. And then the last matter, the matter of modality, so the matter of morality. Here I want to talk about freedom, because nowadays the natural science, which is very much materialist, is denying free will. And nowadays we have biologists, we have neuroscientists studying the brain and saying that the human being is not free. But reason clearly tells us that we ought to act as free beings and to treat ourselves and others as free beings, beings who have responsibilities, who have duties, who have a certain dignity that needs to be revered and regarded. And this becomes very relevant in specific fields, like, for example, psychology. I find that nowadays certain psychological conditions are treated as sort of fate that can't be changed. So, for example, when people are depressed, I hear people talk about how, well, something is wrong in their brains. Their brains are not working correctly, the wrong chemicals are working in their brains, and therefore they have to feel bad. They have to feel depressed. And this is something, they are victims. This is something that is not in their own power. Maybe they can get certain drugs, they can get antidepressants to help them, but they themselves cannot influence their happiness. And I have found depressed people themselves taking up that victim stance. So some people, when you give them advice, when you say, well, you are depressed because you approach life in a way where you erect walls around yourself, and then when you hit those walls you break down. Don't erect walls like that. Rather look for your freedom, give yourself space and time, and look where there is a way around the wall. And you are depressed like that because you have nothing to do, you have no purpose, you have no impact in the world. Quite the contrary, you find that the things you care about are out of your power, you feel powerless. Once you find your power, once you find something to do and have influence in, you will feel better. I find that sometimes when you tell people that, they will respond with, no, I'm depressed because something is wrong with my brain. Nothing I do can change that. And here the thing is, I don't want to get into the area of the biologist and of the neuroscientist. Just like for Kant, it was very important to respect the boundaries and the borders between the different fields. I'm not saying that there isn't something happening in the brain. I'm not saying that depressed people might not have something else going on in their brains than non-depressed people. But I'm saying this victim stance clearly gets you nowhere. It clearly isn't helping. Morality says, the moral law says, we have to regard ourselves as free. And the moral law says we have to act in a certain way. We have to take responsibility in a certain way. And therefore, this is what we should do. And if we do that, I would claim that this might also help with depression. And Greta Thunberg, whom I already mentioned, is a very clear and very good example of how this happened. I don't think that her brain changed in any way, but her way of approaching life changed when she started doing her activism. And that is when she turned from someone depressed and someone who wouldn't really speak with most people, who wouldn't eat, to someone very happy and constantly laughing and giggling through interviews. In the same way, I have heard it said that certain people are simply evil. That sociopaths, once again, something is wrong with their brains, and therefore they can't feel compassion. They can't put themselves in the shoes of others. They don't care about others, and that is simply how they are wired. That is simply how their brains function. So all we can do is try to make sure they don't harm anyone. All we can do if they do harm someone is lock them away. But we can't heal them because the fault is in their brains, not in their free decision. And here once again, what my reason, what morality tells me, no matter what experience may say about the brain of some sociopath, is this is a human being. I ought to treat him as a human being and not just as a wild animal which is just following instincts and can't help itself. If this person does something evil, I judge him for it. Because I look at him as someone who was free to not do that evil. And therefore, I believe that it is my duty to turn this person good, to talk to this person and to try to change his ways. And so, to finally conclude this lecture, what we can learn here from Kant through this topic of the conflict of faculties is twofold. It is that the common person should not just turn off his thinking and be passive, be a victim, and give himself over blindly to experts telling him what to do, telling him how to live his life, but rather he should use his reason. He should be aufklärt and responsible for himself. And in those things, in those questions that really matter in his life, he should think for himself. And then on the other hand, philosophy should not try to be like the other faculties. It should not try to copy them, to also be just empiricist, to also give positive advice, to also rule, to also not be about morality. Because if it does that, it loses all its value and all its justification for existence. Because when it tries to just be like the other faculties, it will be nothing. The other faculties will always be better at that. What philosophy can excel at and what philosophy should do is serving the common people, serving the common sense and the healthy rationality, serving Aufklärung by keeping the presumptions of the other faculties away, not really understanding or knowing more than the layman, but giving his understanding and his free thinking a fundament and saving him from or keeping away the pseudo arguments of the learned man, of the scholars that might distract him. So this is the task for the common person who should aufklären himself, and the task for the philosopher. Both tasks in the over 200 years since Kant's death, both tasks have not been done. That is very clear and evident. Both the common person and the philosopher have failed to do what Kant wanted them to do. It would be a first important step, even though it wouldn't solve the whole problem, of course, but it would be a first important step to at least become aware of that task, so that one could consciously set that task for oneself and try to accomplish that task. And even that has not happened so far. The scholars, the historians of philosophy, the philosophologists, even when studying Kant, have largely failed to make it so clear and so obvious that this is what Kant is about. I don't know, of course, I don't know the whole extensive literature on Kant. It was enough to read Kant himself. So I don't want to do injustice to someone who may have written about this. But I at least don't know, and at least when studying, I don't learn about this, of anyone having, as clearly as I now have, examined this conflict of the faculties that Kant was concerned with, to find in that the key to understanding what Kant was all about and what he wanted from both the common people and the philosophers. But with that now out of the way, I hope that you can understand Kant better, both if you read him yourself and if you keep listening to me. And with that, I want to conclude all these lectures on what does philosophy mean to Kant. And I want to move on with the next week to a new topic, that is, how is thinking done according to Kant? What is Kant's method to thinking? Because as I said in this lecture, Kant says that you can't learn philosophy, but you can learn how to philosophize. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Kubilai Celik, Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lening, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung cause.